When I first became interested in bat conservation, I had no idea how involved I would become. There's been so much to learn, and I'm still learning. And I'm still filled with wonder at what these amazing animals have to teach us. Why? What's so special about bats? Let's start at the beginning with a question. What are bats? This mother pipistrelle suckling her baby gives us the clue. Like us, bats are mammals, giving birth to live young and suckling them on milk. And there is, of course, a story behind this picture. I was contacted by a householder whom my husband and I had previously visited regarding the bats roosting in her eaves. She was very concerned that a timber from the corner of the cottage had collapsed and bats had fallen out. When we went over, we found this mother pipistrelle on the lawn. Her home had literally collapsed around her, but in broad daylight, she'd come down to comfort and suckle her baby. How brave is that? And it highlights the wonderful bond between mother and pup. But no photograph can give you a real sense of how tiny that baby was. So I'd like you to see a video of an orphan bat being cared for by Hazel, one of many bat carers who come to the rescue at such times. Can we see Hazel now on her? Thanks.
What are you doing, Hazel?
I'm hand rearing a baby common pipistrelle bat. Unfortunately, he was orphaned recently. The female bats in the colony moved because of the bad weather, and he was either dropped as they were moving or he was just left behind. And all the adult bats have gone from the roost. So he crawled out, was dropped and was found on the front doorstep of the house where the roost had been. He was only a few days old when he came to us. We've had him about 3 days. He only weighed 1.1 gram when he arrived, and last night he'd gone up to 1.4 grams.
I think you can see from that. It just amazes me every time I see still a pipistrelle in the hand. They are so tiny because they look so much bigger when they're flying. So bats are mammals. We seem to have lost our pictures, Naomi.
Sorry, I had to stop your share so I could show the video. So if you want to share screen again.
No, that's not the one we want. That's the one we want, isn't it? There we go. All right. So bats are mammals, but they're very special mammals in that they're absolutely unique. Come along. Arrows, not arrowing. Not quite sure. I'm not moving it. Nothing's happening here. I'll have to do it this way. Right. So bats are unique amongst mammals in that they truly fly. Not glide like some other mammals, but they fly. And they fly with their hands. Imagine your fingers growing to the length of your arms. And this would be the framework of your wing. If you look here, you can see the wrist here. You can't quite see the thumb. It's the only one with a claw on. Here we've got the shoulder. And then the fingers, the fourth other fingers, the second and the third, very close together because that gives a strong leading edge to the wing. And then the fourth and the fifth, absolutely huge. Now, you imagine if your fingers were as long as your body. And that it explains why bats do look so very large. And if we actually look at the skeleton of a bat and a person, you can see that they're the same bones. They're different proportions, but the bones are just the same. You can see these very long finger bones here. When I first became interested in bats, I remember being amazed at how many different species there were in the world. Millions of years ago, I'm not getting on very well with this. I don't know why it's not going to, can one of you back there help me why I'm not going on to my next slide?
If you click directly on the slide and then try your keyboard buttons again, it may just not be sure that it wants the keyboard control.
Right, okay, thanks, perfect. Right, so millions of years ago, as bats evolved, flight enabled them to spread all over the world so that they could explore different habitats and discover different foods, so that they were able with flight to reach lands and islands that no other mammals could get to. So here you can see they really are every part of the world except the Antarctic, where there's no food and so you've got no bats. Again, when I first got interested in bats, we were told there are nearly 1,000 different species of bat in the world. Well, now we know that there are over 1,400 different species of bat in the world, and I suspect that there'll be many more to be discovered. And quite often, what appears to be one species, when they're really looked into carefully, then they're found that there are more, species look very similar, but they're actually different ones. So here we can see, that works that way, thank you. Here we can see the extremes of size. The largest bats are the flying foxes, a group of fruit bats only found in the old world tropics and the subtropics. And this huge fruit bat has a wingspan of nearly 2 meters. That looks enormous, and it looks pretty big when it's flying, and yet the bat, again, is nearly all wing. Its body, it only weighs less than a bag of sugar. And here's our other smallest one, unless there's a smaller one that nobody's discovered yet. This is the tiny Bumble Bee Bat, which is even smaller than our tiny pipistrelle. How tiny their babies must be. The greatest number of different species is found in the tropics, where food is available all the year round. And different bats choose different foods, and in doing so, help us, as many of the foods we take for granted depend on these tropical bats for pollination and to spread seed. This is your grey-headed flying fox, which, as it takes nectar from the flower, will actually carry pollen on its fur to the next flower, just as bees do. This is another tropical bat, which is really important for the regeneration of the forest. When it's been felled, trees have been taken down, this spreads so many seeds, these long seed pods here, that it brings up the very first of the trees in the forest. So it's much more quickly, of course, growing in the tropics than here. And this is another little fruit-eating bat, a lot of people's favourite little white tent bat. But most bats in the world eat insects, like this nocturnal bat, which is one of our bats here, taking a moth. So what about our UK bats? 17 species are known to breed in the UK. That's almost a quarter of our mammal species, and here are just some of them. We have 2 bat families represented, the 2 on the right of horseshoe bats, which they really look the way bats you think ought to look. But most of our bats are plain face, the Vesper bats, and yet each of them has its own very specialist places that they prefer and food that they like to eat. So what do they eat? Well, all our bats eat insects. No tropical food for them here because we don't have a hot summer, but they all eat insects. And here we've got a long-eared bat actually has just caught a moth. Some of them would take other small creatures like spiders, but insects are their main food. And just as throughout the world, there are more bats taking insects, either on just insects or including them in the more varied diet than any other diet. But all our bats are nocturnal. They rest by day and they come out at night to feed. So how are they going to catch their insect food in the dark? They have an amazing system. It was only explained in the 1930s. They see with sound. As they fly, they send out shouts that bounce back like a ball as echoes if they hit something. The system is known as echolocation, locating things by their echoes. So just as we might use a torch in the dark to light up things in front of us, bats use a torch of sound, hearing every leaf, every tree or insect. And they don't just get a picture of it, they get a huge amount of information. They can tell which direction an insect may be flying, they can tell its size, its speed, and so on. In fact, it just still amazes me that they can actually select their preferred insects, and that's all in total darkness. The sounds that they make are very, very high pitch because that gives them clearer echoes, so high that we're unable to hear most of them without a bat detector. This is a gadget that reduces their calls to an audible level. If you have a bat detector or have already been on a bat walk, you'll hopefully have had the amazing experience of hearing bats flying around you, echolocating, without seeing them at all in the darkness. But some insects can hear the bats shouting, warning them that there may soon be bat supper. So an arms race between bats and insects has been evolving through millions of years. Just going to show a clip now from a BBC programme presented a while back by Chris Packham, who is BCT's president. And this shows how long-eared bats have managed to stay ahead of moths, their favourite prey. Thanks, Naomi.
Now, echolocation is all very well, but in a constant arms race between predator and prey, it's important for bats to stay one step ahead. The tympanate moth has developed a remarkable response to echolocation, a rudimentary ear. If it senses an incoming sonic pulse, it takes immediate evasive action. But it may well have met its match. This is the long-eared bat. It still uses echolocation, but when it gets close to its prey, it enters stealth mode. It switches off its targeting mechanism and instead relies on a far more conventional sense. It's able to hear even the slightest movements, thanks to its enormous ears. It's now a game of patience. All the moth has to do is stay perfectly still. One tiny move, and it's all over.
Thank you. Isn't that fantastic? I just love that film. And to think that, well, I often wonder now what the next step is going to be. Who's going to make the next move in the arms race between bats and moths? So we've seen some of the big advantages of flight, but it has a big disadvantage too. Flight, yeah. We lost a picture, Naomi.
Sorry, yeah, you'll need to share again because I put the video up instead. That's it.
Okay. The disadvantage of flight is that it uses a huge amount of energy. And in the UK, that's provided by insects diet. So they need a lot of insects, and particularly the females in the summer when they're pregnant or lactating. This is a maternity roost of soprano pipistrelle bats. They get together in the summertime, helps to keep each other warm too and for safety. And here you can see they have given birth. The babies can't be more than a day or two old. They haven't got their fur yet. But how about the winter? There aren't many insects about then, certainly not enough to keep the bats going. But they have an amazing strategy for survival, which is based on temperature control. We can't change our temperature. In fact, if it changes quite slightly, we don't feel at all well. But generally, but they are able to actually drop their temperature. And generally speaking, in summer, while the females go somewhere warm for a few weeks and give birth, in the winter, all of the bats would try to find somewhere cool, just like this one here, and tuck themselves away in a crack or a cranny, often somewhere underground where it's humid, and they'll drop their temperature to match that of their surroundings. And that way, they don't use up much energy at all. They can last sometimes for weeks without food at a really low temperature. I like to think of it as being rather like the TV being left on standby. So to survive then, bats need three main things. They need to have to know of places they can forage for lots of food where there's a diversity of insects gathering. Water near trees is ideal, like this one here. They need a choice of safe places to roost, a choice because these places will be different through the year, warm in summer, cool in winter. And they also need safe links, like hedges and tree lines, so that they can travel between the roosts and the feeding places. Their needs are so broad that bats are recognized as indicator species, a measure of the health of the environment, reflecting the quality and the changes in the environmental conditions. But people are making life increasingly difficult for bats. There are fewer wild places supporting insects. We hear a lot about insect numbers having declined. And there are fewer safe places for them to roost, either in old trees or buildings, old buildings. There's a massive loss of hedges and trees. So how can we help? Well, we can. If you have a garden, try to grow a diversity of plants in order to attract a diversity of insects. And it doesn't have to be a stately home or a parkland. I love this small garden I visited. It's a 3-bedroom, semi-detached house in an urban area, and yet it's fitted in a whole range of plants. There's a pond, there's a log pile, which will be a good spot for insects. There's grass, some grass left long as food for insect larvae, which is important. You've got to have food for the larvae as well as the insects. And yes, pipistrelles do feed over the garden in summer and roost in the bat boxes. Though you can't guarantee that, but if you do try and think about your garden, then you will attract wildlife, even if it isn't bats. And if you don't have a garden, it's surprising what you can do with a window box or a container to provide food for insects. Think about the flowers that you're going to put. Try and have a good diversity. Now, these can only be fed on by insects with very long tongues, butterflies and moths, to reach deep down into the nectar. Here we have a nice open flower, and insects with short tongues can feed here. It's interesting to look at flowers in your garden and see how many which insects are attracted to each one. But of course, you need a slightly larger bat to catch a large moth, large enough to take that nectar. And so a pipistrelle couldn't cope with that, whereas pipistrelles are really keen on the tiny insects that will come to these open flowers. So try and think of a range of flowers, a range of shapes. And as I said, even if you don't attract bats, you will be attracting other wildlife. And it's important to try and have something from early in the year in flower to the end, because when the bats come out of hibernation, having tucked away for the winter, they're hungry. And so they want to find some insects to feed on as soon as possible. And it's much easier to find flowers later in the year, but early in the year isn't quite so easy, thinking somewhere in bloom. If you'd like to offer bats somewhere to roost, a home, then you can find the design for this very simple bat box on the BCT website. It's something useful for you to make in lockdown ready for the spring, or make more than one. This photo was taken from below, and you can see 5 pipistrelles roosting in there, but we have counted up to 28 bats out of a box of this design. They like to be squashed tightly together. And this is put here to remind me to ask you, please, if you have a cat, do keep it in the evenings, especially in the summertime when there are young bats or pregnant females flying, because it's quite natural for them to just chase anything that's moving. Cats are natural predators, and many bats are brought to bat carriers injured by cats during, just using them as playthings, really. And we've moved so many trees and old buildings like barns that bats will often seek out places to roost in other buildings, quite often our own houses, and not necessarily old ones, just usually for a short time in the summer. Most generally, this will be for maternity roosts. And if you're lucky enough for this to happen to you and you want to know more about how to look after your lodges, the helpline are ready to help you. So do contact them if you have any queries or concerns. But I believe that the most important thing you can do to help bats is to tell others about them and to share with them the wonder of these amazing mammals. Pinned above my desk is a quote I jotted down many years ago from one of David Attenborough's programs. I feel it says it all. He said, "Bats are a vital part of our natural heritage, and it's a part we cannot afford to lose." Thank you.